Here's another important video from the Personal Defense Network.
When it comes to your personal defense, there's really only one thing that you can be sure you're going to have with you in the middle of your critical incident. It's not your firearm, it's not a knife, it's not a flashlight, it's not any kind of tool whatsoever. It's your body. Sometimes we refer to the body as the human weapon system. With us today is Dr. Robert Smith of Direct Action Medical Network. Direct Action Medical Network coined the phrase human weapon system to talk about the body in the context of a dynamic critical incident, both from the standpoint of strengthening and understanding how our body works and being able to break down the enemy's weapon, their human weapon system, when it comes time for them to stop hurting us and we decide to take action. Thanks for joining us, Doc.
Appreciate the invitation. Thanks. Direct Action Medical Network is a group of physicians and surgeons throughout the country who participate in the training and the support of operators for special operations groups and for law enforcement also. We have gotten the idea of the human weapon system and the biomechanics and how we integrate in our environment with each other socially and in dynamic responses to conflict.
Now, in addition to the work that Direct Action Medical Network has done, Dr. Smith has actually worked with me in my programs, working with special operations personnel as well as civilians, trying to help them understand how their body works. Now, tell us a little about your background, because one of the things that's really important to us is the why. We don't like to just put out information and let it stand on its own. We like to explain why. Who better to talk about why the human body works a certain way than a physician?
We are trained early on in our medical careers in anatomy. And the practical application of that anatomy is what we're really talking about here today. My background is that I work with law enforcement teams on the teams, actually, and we have studied how people move and how they integrate and how they fight. And that's our background.
So as a medical doctor, you're certainly qualified to talk about the body. You've studied the body exhaustively, and especially in the context of defense, context of defending yourself, context of breaking down that combatant who's trying to hurt you. Based on science, we can make certain assumptions about the way the body is going to behave and also the most efficient way to use the body to interact with those tools like the firearms and the knives and the flashlights that we use when we want to defend ourselves and we have the opportunity to get to them. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Okay, absolutely. The way that we integrate with our environment primarily is both with our mind and with our hands. These structures are unique to humans. And for example, our hands are very, very sensitive and take up a large part of the anatomy of our brain. And how we feel and touch and utilize our hands makes a big difference with how we defend ourselves. For example, humans in general, when they're startled, they'll throw their hands up to block the vision, the command and control, and the airway of the system itself. And so when startled, the person will recoil into a flexion position and bring their hands up to protect their face, their eyes, and their airway. That is a natural response regardless of the age of the individual. When they're startled, they'll recoil and move into a flexion position and put their hands up to block themselves.
And of course, we've talked about the idea of integrating that flinch response into such things as presentation of a firearm from the holster. Because when you're caught off guard, that worst case scenario is going to put you into that position.
Absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit more about research and some of the studies you're familiar with that contribute to our knowledge of how best to be efficient when it comes to shooting, for example.
Well, there's a great study that was done back in 2001 at the University of Edinburgh where they set up an electroencephalogram, which is an EEG. And what they did was they did that study in the context of having shooters, target shooters, who were professional shooters, hit and also miss. And what they found was that the EEG actually changed and that the focus of that EEG demonstrated that the person that was shooting was not looking necessarily at his weapon or at the target, but the whole scenario all at once. And some really good research has come out with that. And that is the documentation of what we see in combat-focused shooting and what we see all the way to sport. For example, when a basketball player shoots a basketball, he's not necessarily looking at the basketball, over the basketball, toward the hoop. He's looking at where he's wanting to throw that basketball. And humans do that with all their weapons that they use. And they also do that when they're working hand to hand. They're not looking at their fist as they're fixing to throw a punch. They're looking at where they're going to put that punch. And this documentation and that study demonstrates that.
So when we look to the clinical experiments, when we look to very controlled, peer-reviewed journal articles, things like that, controlled areas of science that are doing the research, we see things that back up and give us principles to start with when we want to develop efficient techniques and tactics also.
Exactly.
What else has come out of science in the recent years that you can say has helped to develop a technique, or maybe to reaffirm the righteousness of something that we've been training?
I think one of the things that's important when looking at that is the advances in physical training and in proprioception, which is a fancy word for having a sense of where you are in space, and the move toward training that way and making athletes more efficient is backed up by the fact that it's clinically it integrates both the muscular system and the neurological system.
Now, would that help us, the principles of proprioception help us to make things less mechanical and choreographed and more trust our intuitive ability to bring our hands together in space for something like a reload?
That's exactly right. And what it does is it helps us focus on the repetitive motion skills. What you're really doing there when you're doing repetitive motion skills is you're making that movement very fluid, and you're doing it with a purpose that becomes second nature, if you will.
Now, one of the things we throw around a lot and we hear talked about is muscle memory. And these words have meaning to everyone in the training community, and everybody thinks that they have some idea what muscle memory is. I think in 2009, most of us accept the idea that there is no actual muscle memory, but the phrase gets thrown out a lot. Talk to me a little bit about the concept and which parts of it are important when it comes to repetitive training.
The things that are most important about that is that the neurological pathway and the integration of the musculoskeletal system with the neurological system becomes very, very patterned, so that it's almost like developing a rut in a road, so that it becomes ingrained. And we see that in other areas also. For example, a person who's had an amputation, for example, a foot amputation, that foot doesn't exist any longer, but the patient will complain, or the person will complain about pain in that foot. There has developed over time a course of neurological pathway that is ingrained in that individual. Likewise, when we're training, the quote muscle memory, which actually doesn't exist, is better defined, I guess you should say, as that integration of the neurological system with the muscular system as a basis for a response to a certain threat or to a certain situation, for example.
So the stimulus comes in and we practice what we're going to do for our response. We try to differentiate between natural reactions and learned responses. That response through repetitive training becomes the default pathway.
It becomes more reflexive, and it falls into that rut, and then that stimulus creates that action.
Now, talking about visualization, because I firmly believe that visualization is an important part of that training. Once you've learned how to do a skill, we always recommend people visualize themselves going through the motions of that skill, or watch other people doing it, maybe even on video, when they can't actually train themselves. What do you feel the value is there?
I think there's a profound value, and the literature certainly supports that, as does our life experience. And what's happening there, once again, is you're concentrating on what's going on in that system. And when you spend time putting that information in your neurological system, you're going to condition yourself to respond to that stimulus in that fashion.
So when it comes to training, not only repetitive motion, but also visualizing that repetitive motion, once you've learned it, and I want to stress that, you can't visualize doing something you haven't gone out and practiced. The value just isn't going to be there. Once you've practiced it and you created that rut in the road, I love that, then the idea is by visualizing, you're going to be able to reinforce that concept. So when we talk about why we do things, understanding the way the body works, understanding how we integrate with our tools, and understanding that developing the muscle memory rut in the road comes from repetitive training and in visualizing that training are all really important.
Check out more videos just like this one at the Personal Defense Network.